삶이 참 고되고 마음을 지치게 하는 인간관계도 되게 많고 모든 일에 우리가 필요 이상으로 너무 힘들게 애를 쓰고 있다면 자신의 한계까지 밀어붙이는 게 최선일까요? 더 쉽고 빠르게 목적에 이룰 수는 없는 걸까요? 그 목표를 이룰 수 있는 방법에 대해서 이야기하고 싶어서 안녕하세요. 존스 홉킨스 의과대학 소아정신과 교수 지나영입니다. 삶이 참 고되고 마음을 지치게 하는 인간관계도 되게 많고 어깨를 짓누르는 과중한 일, 해도 끝 안 나는 하루의 일과까지 이 모든 게 견디기 힘들다 이런 날들이 많습니다. 어떤 분들은 이런 상황을 좀 이겨내보려고 더 오랫동안 더 치열하게 일에 매달리기도 하는데요. 반면에 내가 모든 일에 우리가 필요 이상으로 너무 힘들게 애를 쓰고 있다면 그럴 때도 정말 무조건 자신의 한계까지 밀어붙이는 게 최선일까요? 더 쉽고 빠르게 목적에 이룰 수는 없는 걸까요? 저는 오늘 여러분과 함께 좀 더 수월하고 편안한 마음으로 그 목표를 이룰 수 있는 방법에 대해서 이야기하고 싶어서 책을 한 권 가지고 나왔는데요. 그렉맥커운의 최소노력의법칙입니다. 저는요, 되게 외향적이고 좀 사회적인 걸 좋아하는 이런 사람이에요. 그래서 항상 좀 열심히 일하기도 했지만 또 열심히 놀기도 했고 가만히 앉아있는 시간이 너무 아깝고 일할 때는 연구하고 환자 보고 그 시간 외에는 책 읽는 걸 좋아해서 제가 북클럽을 만들어가지고 5년 동안 진행을 했습니다. 정말 쉴 틈 없이 1분 1초가 꽉 차 있었어요. 그렇게 살던 어느 날 제가 장거리 운전을 하고 있는데 갑자기 지금까지 느껴본 적 없는 이상한 통증이 느껴지기 시작했습니다. 그 이후로 여러 가지 다른 증상들이 하나씩 일어나면서 일어나기 힘들 만큼 몸이 무너져 버렸는데요. 병명은 자율신경계 장애와 만성 피로 증후군이었어요. 당시에는 1시간 활동하기도 너무 힘들어가지고 거의 아무것도 할 수 없었는데요. 그냥 가만히 방바닥에 누워 있었어야 했던 거예요. 근데 한번 생각해보세요. 제가 소파에 가만히 앉아있는 시간도 잘 견디지 못하는 사람이었거든요. 근데 누워만 있어야 했단 말입니다. 그리고 그때 저를 제일 힘들게 했던 거는 내가 생각했던 해왔던 그 삶이 없어졌다는 거예요. 좌절감과 절망감이 점점 오게 되더라고요. 내 삶이 없어졌으니까. 그러던 중에 당시에 미국에서 베스트셀러였던 그렉맥커운의 에센셜리즘을 읽게 됩니다. 그 책 내용을 간단히 설명하자면 이렇습니다. 우리는 우리 삶의 10개, 20개의 일을 다 잘해야지. 그래야 성공한 거다. 이렇게 생각하는데 사실은 그게 아니다. 오히려 나에게 중요한 소수 몇 가지만 잘해내는 게 더 잘 사는 거다라는 거예요. 그 말을 들으니 정신이 번쩍 들더라고요. 정말 중요한 거 몇 가지만 본질에만 집중하면 된다는 거잖아요. 친구 생일 챙겨주고 북클럽 하고 여행 많이 다니고 운동하고 하던 거는 어떻게 생각해보면 부수적인 일이고 내 삶에서 진짜 중요한 일만 하면 되겠구나 하고 그때부터 생각을 바꾸게 되었습니다. 저처럼 여기까지 생각을 하신 분들이라면 아마 이런 질문 생길 거예요. 내 인생의 진짜 중요한 부분, 네 가족, 건강, 내 직업, 경력 그것만 딱 하고 딴 거는 내려놨다. 그런데 그래도 여전히 힘들면 어떡하지? 그래도 여전히 할 게 너무 많아서 나를 늘 한계치까지 밀어붙이면서 지치면 어떡하지? 최소노력법칙의 저자인 그렉맥커운 역시 이런 같은 질문을 던집니다. 그리고 고민을 많이 하던 끝에 이런 깨달음을 얻었다고 하십니다. 중요하고 가치 있는 일을 쉽게 할 수 있다는 생각은 떠올리기조차 어려워한다. 만약 중요한 일에는 어마어마한 노력이 든다는 잘못된 전제 때문에 일을 그르칠 가능성이 가장 크다면 어떨까? 태도를 바꿔서 일이 어렵게 느껴지는 이유는 아직 더 쉬운 방법을 찾아내지 못했기 때문이라고 생각해보면 어떨까? 인간의 뇌는 어렵게 느껴지는 대상은 저항하고 쉽게 느껴지는 대상은 반기게 되어 있다. 이 편향을 가리켜 인지적 용이함 원칙 또는 최소노력의 원칙이라고 부른다. 우리는 보통 중요한 업무를 맡으면 그걸 막 오랜 시간 애써서 해야 한다고 생각하잖아요. 최선을 다해서 열심히 달리는 것만이 옳다. 이렇게 배웠습니다. 그런데 그렉맥커운은 정반대의 접근 방식을 취한다면 어떨까 하고 생각해 본 거예요. 그리고 이 책을 통해서 더 쉽고 수월하게 일을 하면서 지속적인 성과를 낼 수 있는 방법을 제시하고 있는데요. 여러분, 이제 대체 그 방법이 어떤 방법인지 궁금하시죠? 지금부터 저자인 그렉맥커운과 화상 인터뷰를 통해 자세한 이야기를 나눠보려고 하는데요. 그럼 우리 함께 만나보실까요?
Hello, Greg.
It's
How
so
are you?
wonderful. It's so nice to be with you. Thank you.
Oh my God, so great to see you. I'm such a fan of you.
Wow.
I read Essentialism a few years ago when I was really sick. And your book really gave me to think different mindset. And I was able to not be demoralized because I couldn't do anything. But I focused on what I can do and what's important. And I began writing my first book.
That's amazing. I love that you were able to utilize essentialism in a way that was really, it's so life-changing. That's a beautiful thing. I'm so inspired to hear that. Thank you.
I'm like, I have goosebumps thinking about it because I was almost like giving up because I was bedridden for almost a year. But your book I read and I thought, okay, a lot of things are not that important. I was able to think, I was able to read, I was able to do like, right?
What you're saying is beautiful because sometimes in life we have boundaries that are forced on us and they can be very demoralizing and discouraging. And I just think about the pandemic and what that's done for people and how in a sense it's forced them into a position to have to think about their lives differently. But sometimes they just still feel discouraged and exhausted. But what you're saying is that in a similar circumstance, essentialism gave you permission or a mindset to do life differently. So you were able to be successful even though you had all of these health limits that you were faced with. I think sometimes these experiences we have in life, if we say they're not happening to me, but they're happening for me,
Absolutely.
then it opens us up to the idea that there really are important lessons. And I know I'm saying something that's probably quite obvious, but it helps us to recognize there might be many more layers to these ideas. You know, because I often observe that in any field of endeavor, there are people who are not just a little more successful, but there will be people that may be 100 times more successful. And they're not working 100 times harder. They're not working 100 times more hours. So we have to look beyond that one way of getting results to consider other higher leverage activities. Well, it's really like this. It's like people are having what I would call a 10x dilemma. And that is that you and I and everybody watching this or listening to this, everyone wants better results, even 10x results. But no one can work 10 times harder.
No one, no. 24 hours, yeah.
And so when you put those two things together, you can see that just trying to work 10 times harder will not get us there. And so we have to find a smarter, better, simpler, easier way so we can make, breakthrough results, but without burning out.
Yeah, like I just was fascinated when you said effortless inversion. First I thought that's just how can hard work to be easy? And then I read all of your book and guess what? Now anything I do, any important project, I ask that question, how could this be easy? And you mentioned this importance of a steady pace of work. And I thought that was a really interesting idea. Not only you put the minimum bound, lower bound, but you also have an upper bound.
We've been conned into believing that to get maximum output, we need to max out all the time. And that's not correct. If you want maximum output over time, you must set boundaries on how much you do today, because you want to be in a position to be at peak performance tomorrow and the next day and 10 years from now. You don't want to max out for 5 hours. You want to max out over 50 years. The upper and lower bound, I mean, one way I applied that in my own life was in writing a diary, a journal. Most people, when they start to write a journal, they write too much the first day. They write 3 pages, an essay. By day 2, it's already over. They go, oh, I can't write 2-3 pages today. I'm behind because of yesterday writing. And so they don't write their journal.
Right.
What I did instead, what worked for me, was to have a lower bound of no less than 1 sentence a day, but also an upper bound of no more than 5 sentences a day. So that day 1, you want to write more, but you hold back, you restrain yourself. And then day 2, you think, well, I can do, 5 sentences, I can do that. Or if I'm really busy, 1 sentence is enough. In this way, I have not missed a day now in almost 11 years.
That's really amazing, because if you didn't have the upper bounds, there must be some days that you might have missed.
Right.
Yeah.
And so the key to human performance is consistency, not intensity. When we go for intensity, we make progress, we can see progress, but we forget that we're also going to have whole days of no progress. And that will be very discouraging. So you will know the story, but the great race to the poles, to who will be the first person to get to the South Pole. Two teams set off on the same day. One team just went to their maximum amount. And what that meant was that on good weather days, when the sun was shining, they would go 20, 30, 40, maybe even more miles. But on the bad weather days, they were so tired that they just had to stay in their tents. They couldn't make progress against the bad weather. On the other side, the other team, they said 15 miles a day, never more, never less, or as close to 15 miles as we can. Now, here's the question. Did they win? Yes, they got there first. How much faster was that consistent, steady approach than the boom and bust approach? They beat the other British team by 30 days. They're 30 days faster than the British team. They're way ahead of them. And not only that, because they're not burned out, they were able to safely make the journey back to Norway, thousands of miles back to Norway. The British team was so burned out, they all died on the way home. That's the idea, is to discover that peak performance isn't achieved by forcing ourselves past our limits constantly.
And then another part I think it was really fascinating for me was that you say the work can be fun, or work and play can be together, and work can be enjoyable. Again, when I first heard it, like, that's too magical, right? I was like, how can you do that? And tell us about that a little bit more.
Well, I mean, there is a dominant idea that says the more important the work, the harder it has to be. People believe it. And so then they create work experiences and work environment that support that. You have whole industries that do this. The medical industry will say, well, of course, in your years of qualifying yourself as a doctor, of course you will work 100 hours a week. Of course you will not You won't sleep properly all the way through that. That's the price you have to pay. That's what I did. So now that's what you have to do. And whole industries do this. It's not just the medical industry. And so you pass on, this is the way we've always done it type thinking. It's equivalent to bloodletting. For thousands of years, the medical profession, because they had a limited paradigm, a limited mindset about how the human body works, believed that you would help people to be well by removing blood, using leeches. Literally leeches to suck out the blood or to siphon it out in other ways. There's very high-profile examples of famous figures, King Charles II, I think, and George Washington in the United States, who arguably were at least weakened or perhaps killed by bloodletting. All the while, it was causing damage, but they believed that it was working, and they trusted the belief over the evidence. Well, that's same for saying work can't be fun. It just has to be drudgery. Who made that rule?
Right. Where's the evidence? Yeah.
Yes, where's the evidence that that's what actually leads to high performance on teams? It's not true. It's not true. What you want is to have an environment that combines enjoyment with the essential work. As you look for ways to construct that type of work environment, you find there are ways to do it. In a simple and very small example in our own family,
yes.
We found that cleaning up after dinner was drudgery for us. And we said, okay, how can we make it more enjoyable? And we divided up the roles and we had some training. And at first that wasn't enough. But then my daughter said, well, listen, okay, in addition to that, let's put on a certain kind of music. She chose Disney classic music. Whatever it is, it became a little party. And then now, literally now, you will find that when we're doing this, when we put on the music, people are dancing, they're singing, we are getting on with it. The job gets done, but it's a lot of fun. And that's the goal, is to shift from work that's drudgery to rituals that are enjoyable in and of themselves. How can you make not just the reward for work enjoyable, but that you say, no, the work itself is enjoyable. We make a ritual so that we enjoy the process of doing something as well as the outcome. Think about Marie Kondo with her approach to tidying up.
Yeah.
I think one of the things she did that was so interesting, and one of the reasons it was has been such a phenomenon, at least in the United States, is because everyone used to think of tidying as monotonous drudgery. But what she was able to establish was, if you do it in a certain way, there is joy in the process, the way you fold the clothes. There's something satisfying in the way you do it. And so you can enjoy the process. And you make even tidying can become a ritual. Well, if tidying can become a ritual, if tidying up your dinner after dinner can become a ritual, anything can be turned into a ritual. And that's so important because most of our life is the stuff in between, before the results that we're working towards actually happen. Sometimes it's not obvious what the first step is. You just have to sit around and talk and think about it for a while. The question is, can you physically do that step right now? If the answer to that is no, you probably don't have the first step yet. I'm thinking here of the Netflix founder who had this vision to create a streaming video service online. I mean, we all know what the vision is now because we can see it and have experienced it. But he had that vision at least for 15 years because I heard him share his vision 15 years ago. And at that time, he said, look, we don't even have the infrastructure for this yet. So we can't just make this happen yet. He could have tried to raise $100 million or more to build out the infrastructure. But instead, what he did, he and his co-founder went and bought a secondhand CD and went to the post office and mailed it to themselves. And the next morning, when it arrived, unscratched and unbroken, they said, okay, we think we have an idea. We can begin. We don't have to build all the infrastructure. We can just start mailing people DVDs back and forth. And that will be our entry into this world. And as the technology caught up, they've been able to then execute their vision. But you see, that's the idea. Start with the tiny, obvious first step.
It doesn't have to be perfect. It can be rubbish. Because I think a lot of young people here are almost like paralyzed because they think that they might fail and their plan is not ready and they can't even have the first step, take the first step.
Yes, and perfectionism, when you have very high expectations placed on you, and excuse me for this, but I think Korea is a very high expectation culture. So I think a lot of people do feel this from their parents and from their work environments. Of course, high expectation itself isn't a terrible thing, but if you think because of high expectation that your first version has to be perfect, then it becomes a substantial disadvantage because then you won't do the exact thing you need to do. I'm thinking here of the Kramer Prize, which was started by Henry Kramer, an industrialist in London, and he was trying to encourage human-powered flight. This was many years after the Wright brothers had proven that flight was possible. It was only 10 years before there would be a man walking on the moon. So it was a great age of flight. And he didn't think that his objective was going to take very long to achieve. The goal was people had to basically create a bike with wings and show that you could make that fly around a figure eight in a big field around these two pylons. But the goal, the prize, went unrewarded for 17 years. No one achieved it for 17 years. And that was despite lots of teams putting in lots of money and coming at this problem to try and really get it, to achieve it. And enter Paul McCready. Paul McCready was broke. He had no money. He had no institution supporting him. He had no team to speak of. I mean, he had friends and family. When he was staring at this problem, he realized everyone was trying to solve the wrong problem. That was the big insight. Everyone was trying to build the perfect machine, gorgeous, perfect, so that it would have these slats on them and these beautiful wood and plastic, and they looked amazing. And they would be built in studios and come out, and they would, wow, look at this thing. This is going to change the world. It looked like magnificent. And then they would try to fly them and they would crash. It's exactly what would be expected. But the problem was it took them 6 months in between the crash and being back up in the air trying again. He said, that's the wrong approach. What you need to do is build a machine that looks as ugly as you like. It can crash and be fixed fast and cheap. That's how he succeeded. He was the winner of the Kramer Prize, and 2 years later, the second Kramer Prize, when they crossed the English Channel, all by human-powered flight.
I really want young people to hear this, because in one sense, the person who were able to afford the most failures succeeded.
Yes, and by afford, there's two ways of thinking about afford, right? You can make mistakes expensive, or you can make expenses cheap. And your goal is to make them cheap in every way you possibly can. In our own family, one of the things we did with our children is we wanted them to have experiences making mistakes with money while they were young. Now, you think you want the opposite at first. You think protect them and make sure they never make a mistake with anything.
Mistake, right.
And the problem with that is that then they don't experience mistakes until maybe they're 30 years old and they buy a house they can't afford, and now they invest in a business and it's too much, and they learn the lesson in a very expensive way. We wanted them to learn it while they were very young, and so we decided we would give them a small amount of money every week, and we asked them to divide this up into 3 glass jars. The first jar was to give away, charity. The second jar was for them to spend right now. And the third jar was for long-term savings. I remember one of my children bought something on a whim, a car that was promised to be able to drive on the ceiling or something. And it crashed, the first day or two, it broke, and that was the end of it. And he'd spent $40 on this, and he felt, he felt that pain of wasting that money. And so after that, became much more careful and disciplined about saving up for something that really mattered to him, instead of something that was just shiny new object right now.
Experience learning-sized failure.
Yes, you want learning-sized mistakes. You want bite-sized mistakes that you can make now. And
I wish we have a lot more time, but we wanted to wrap up a little bit. If you want to say one thing, particularly to Korean population, what would that be, that maybe one thought or one thing they can do to get closer to live a life more effortlessly?
the answer to that question comes out of most difficult challenges in my life so far. One of my daughters went from the picture of health into undiagnosed but neurological condition that left her with almost Parkinson's disease type symptoms. Her body is going slower and slower. Her emotions are, there's no happiness or sadness. There's just neutrality. Her right side of her body stops working. Takes her 2 minutes to write her own name. Everything is very slowed down. And we, in the midst of that, didn't have even the beginning of a diagnosis. We learned in the midst of this that no matter how hard a situation is, you can still make it harder still if you respond in the wrong way. You can make
it harder, yeah.
Yeah, nothing is so hard you can't make it harder by becoming really anxious in your state.
All right.
By being exhausted, by complaining, by worrying. What we discovered was that there is a different way to do life, a second path, an easier, lighter, simpler way. And that looks like this. It says, well, if you have enough time to worry and be anxious and complain, you have enough time to be grateful. What we learned with our daughter's extreme situation was this: if you focus on what you lack, you will lose what you have. But if you focus on what you have, you will gain what you lack. And so this has important, immediate relevance for parents, for teenagers, for people in Korea right now. After you complain, say something you're thankful for. After you criticize your child for something, say something you're thankful for. Every time you have a meeting, begin with what's going right. This will instantly change your state, increases the chance that you're going to have effortless action, and that improves your position to be able to build a system that brings you effortless results. At the time of this conversation, my daughter is thriving, she's doing very well, and she's back. But it was a 2 to 2.5 year journey, and if we had got the wrong state, I think it would have made the action so much harder. I don't know that we would have ended up with the result that we have. So it really was almost a matter, I would say, of life and death to learn this principle.
Absolutely. I mean, thanks so much for sharing that, because I can't imagine how devastating it would have been. I mean, I myself have similar, but I can't imagine having a young daughter in that state. And I'm so glad that your daughter's doing much, much better and back. Yeah. And then I love, and I teach that too as a psychiatrist, radical gratitude. that, and then it's scientifically actually in your brain, as you said, you have instant change in the mindset. It's actually happening, like serotonin goes up and dopamine goes up when you're grateful for things. And then you say, for Korean people, start with what you're grateful for, what you have, not thinking about what you're lacking. I think that's such moving, it's such an impactful statement. And I'm so thankful that you joined us today and spent a long time to really tell us wisdom.
It is my pleasure to be with you. It's my honor to hear some of your story and to be able to share some of these ideas, especially to the Korean people who I feel such an affinity for, such a love for, really. So thank you for that opportunity.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.